Major depressive disorder is a leading cause of disability across the globe, but its neurobiology has remained incredibly complex and, frankly, a bit of a puzzle. Well, today we're digging into a landmark 2025 umbrella review from molecular psychiatry. This study is a big deal because it proposes a new, unified way to understand what's happening inside the depressed brain. All right, let's get right into it.
So, first question, why has a clear picture been so hard to pin down? Well, for decades, neuroimaging studies have given us this huge amount of data, but a lot of it has been inconsistent, even contradictory. You'd have one study showing a brain region is overactive and another showing that exact same spot is underactive. This kind of conflict, which can be caused by all sorts of things like how long someone has been ill or the methods used, has been a major roadblock.
So, to cut through all of that noise, this study uses a really powerful method called an umbrella review. You can think of it as a review of reviews. Basically, the researchers systematically pulled together the data from 55 different meta-analyses. By doing this, they could filter out all those inconsistencies and isolate the most consistent, the most robust signals, the core patterns of what's really changing in the brain during MDD.
And what did that clear signal actually reveal? Well, here's the crucial insight. MDD isn't really about a single faulty part of the brain. Instead, what we're seeing is a consistent and predictable imbalance across three huge, large-scale brain networks. This is the foundation for their entire new framework.
Okay, so let's meet this core triad. First up, we've got the soma motor and visual networks, which we can think of as the disconnected self. Then there's the ventral attention network, which acts like the hyperactive alarm. And finally, we have the default mode network, which we'll call the shifting storyteller. It's the dynamic push and pull between these three networks that really defines the neurobiology of depression.
So let's start with the disconnected self. These are the networks in charge of sensing the world around you and moving through it. What the review found is that in MDD, their activity consistently goes down. This slowdown means the brain has a harder time processing signals from the outside world, and that leads directly to two classic symptoms: anhedonia, which is that inability to feel pleasure, and a kind of physical and mental sluggishness we call psychomotor retardation.
Now, in stark contrast, we have the hyperactive alarm, the ventral attention network, or VAN. You can think of this system as the part of the brain that translates all of our internal body sensations into emotions. The review found that the VAN is consistently overactive in MDD, right from the beginning all the way to the most chronic stages. This hyperactivity forces a person's attention inward, creating this state of hyperfocus on internal distress that we experience as anxiety and a persistent negative mood. The third network, our shifting storyteller, is really fascinating because its role actually changes over time. In the early stages of MDD, its activity goes down, which helps explain that cognitive fog and difficulty concentrating that so many people report. But in the chronic stage, its activity flips and becomes hyperactive. And this is the neurological engine behind rumination, that stuck, looping, negative self-talk that is so characteristic of long-term depression. And that dynamic shift in the DMN really brings us to a critical takeaway from all this research. MDD is not a static condition. It's a dynamic disease. Its signature in the brain evolves, and it changes significantly over time. Understanding this progression is absolutely key.
This table shows that difference so clearly. Look at the early stages. The brain is actually trying to fight back. To compensate for low activity in some networks, it paradoxically starts to build up gray matter. It's like trying to turn up the volume on a signal that's too quiet. But that defensive strategy just can't last. In the chronic stage, the whole mechanism collapses. The long-term stress and inflammation become toxic, and you start to see widespread loss of both gray and white matter.
And this is what that actually looks like. Don't worry about all the specific labels here, just focus on the colors. On the left, in early MDD, you see those red dots. That's the brain trying to compensate, building up that gray matter. Now, look at the image on the right, which shows chronic MDD. The red is gone, and in its place is a sea of blue dots. Every single one of those blue dots represents significant loss of gray matter. You're looking at a visual map of the brain's defense systems failing as structural damage sets in.
So, okay, we've seen what happens in the brain. But the big question is, why does it happen? The study puts forward a powerful, unifying driver for all of these changes: chronic, low-grade inflammation.
Here's how they think this chain reaction unfolds. It all starts with a trigger, something like psychosocial stress, which kicks off a state of chronic inflammation in the body. These inflammatory signals then get past the blood-brain barrier, they activate the brain's own immune cells, called microglia, and they directly stimulate a key area called the insula, which is a core hub of that overactive van. This inflammation then throws crucial neurotransmitter systems, especially dopamine and serotonin, out of whack, which finally creates that global network imbalance that we see as depression.
The study sums it up perfectly with this quote. They describe it as a detachment from the environment and a polarization toward disembodied interoceptive imagery. Now, what does that mean? It means the brain's internal world becomes disconnected from external reality. They conclude that this detuning from the environment is the very core of depression.
So, let's put all the pieces together. The final conclusion of this massive review is that we can fundamentally understand MDD as a state where the brain becomes disconnected and quite literally detuned from its environment.
This final model shows the whole story. Let's walk through it. Down at the bottom, you have the root cause, immune dysregulation and chronic inflammation. Now, follow the arrows up to the early stage on the left. You see how that inflammation leads to underactive sensory networks and an overactive alarm network. Now follow the big arrow across to the chronic stage on the right. The inflammation just keeps going, the damage starts to become permanent, and now the DMN, our storyteller, is also hyperactive, locking in that rumination. This entire diagram shows the tragic progression from an inflammatory trigger to a structurally entrenched brain state.
So what are the three big take-home messages here? First, the environmental disconnect. Reduced activity in sensory and motor networks makes it physically harder to experience pleasure from the outside world. Second, the internal polarization. An overactive alarm network traps attention on distressing internal feelings that are disconnected from reality. And third, structural entrenchment. Over the long term, inflammation causes physical brain damage that locks this dysfunctional pattern in place, explaining why MDD can become so chronic and resistant to treatment.
And this all leaves us with a really profound and maybe even hopeful question. If depression is, at its very core, a disease driven by inflammation, could the next big breakthrough in treatment not be a brain drug at all, but a therapy that targets the body's own immune system?